Thanks, Denise, for that introduction. We're excited that you guys are all here, our colleagues from the university system. As she mentioned, I'm Traci Stromie and Josie Baudier is here with me. We're both instructional designers at the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning at Kennesaw State. We work with instructors all across our university who teach in all delivery modalities, and specifically since 2010, we've been working with online instructors on sort of every stage of their design process, whether it's writing objectives, redesigning an online course, or a face-to-face class to the online environment, and seeing what specific learning activities might be most relevant for them. We really want to encourage you as we go forward to think about designing an online course really as its own entity. If you're repurposing or revising an existing offering to online, don't just think, okay, how can I move this entire thing to the online environment? Really take this as an opportunity for redesign so you can really leverage the online environment. Here is our agenda for the time that we have together. We're going to talk about 4 main things. The first is some general considerations with online course design, including organization, navigation, and alignment. The second area that we're going to talk about is understanding by design or backwards design, which is a theory or framework that you can use when approaching design of an online course. The next area that we'll talk about is effective practices for designing online learning, and really some overall things to keep in mind as you move forward. And the last area that we'll talk about very briefly is designing with quality matters in mind.
Hi everyone, this is Josie here. We want to talk about three main criteria to consider when designing online, and those are organization, alignment, and navigation. So I'm going to start here with organization. So first thing we need to do is remember that not only our course materials need to be organized, but the clarity of our course materials needs to be organized as well. So we want to make sure that our students are clear about our expectations and that they know where to go to find the things they need to be successful in the class. So also keep in mind that your content each week needs to be organized, consistent, and maybe even a little redundant. Finding things in more than one place is good for the students. It's hectic for us, the instructors, who have to make changes in multiple places, but it's nice for students to be able to find the things they need, maybe that might be in the syllabus, but also placed in other parts of the course where it's important to them in certain modules, for example. So consider starting each week in a very organized way where you provide the overview of the week and the objectives and then maybe how students are going to achieve them. And then maybe make each week consistent with providing content next, providing opportunities for interaction and learning, providing opportunities for scaffolded learning, informative assessments, and then finally always including that summary in the end. And at some point during the semester, summative assessments, so that your consistency and organization is clear week to week for your students or module to module for your students. And then also keeping in mind the clarity of the expectations that we set for our students as well. Another criteria we like to consider when designing online courses is alignment. And much like this Rube Goldberg machine, we have to be certain that our core components to our course are aligned and connected so that students can actually achieve the goals and the objectives of the course. So we want to make sure that we provide them aligned objectives to assessments, to activities and interactions. And Traci's going to talk more about that in just a second. But the point of this machine that you're looking at right now is to show that all of these pieces need to work together in order for that end goal to be achieved. And that end goal to be achieved is success on those learning objectives in our course. And then the final criteria we're going to talk about before we move on to backward design is navigation. So this is when we design our course, we need to make sure that the students are aware of the flow of the course, which is how they actually move through the course. So your navigation needs to be as intuitive as possible to students. You may, however, need to provide them with a map or a navigation video so that you can show them the intended navigation through your course. It's important that you don't let go of your course design and your intention of the way you want your students to move through your course. Sometimes it is intuitive and it should be intuitive. Sometimes we have to tell them how we want them to move through the course, but it's important that you design your course knowing that your students are going to navigate through it a specific way.
All right, so where do you begin? What do you start with? That's a question that we get a lot when we work and collaborate with faculty on our campus. And as I mentioned, one framework or way to approach designing online courses, or really any course, is using the framework of Understanding by Design by Wiggins and McTighe. So here we have a picture of the Henry Hudson Bridge in New York when it was under construction in 1936. So we have to hope, or really assume, that the engineers that were building this bridge didn't just start throwing stuff together. They had a plan in mind. They knew what they wanted the bridge to look like before they started. They knew how the bridge would function, and they knew in their mind how they would know if this was a success. So they didn't just start connecting the dots. And similarly with our courses, we must begin with the end in mind. What are our goals? What are our objectives for the students? And this is why it's called backwards design. Another reason why it's also called backwards design is because sometimes we as instructors, and Josie and I both teach part-time at KSU, is that we occasionally have the tendency to jump right into the lesson or the activity. So what interesting thing can I do with my students? How can I get them engaged or excited about this topic? So we start thinking about the lesson and the activity, what we're going to do with the students, rather than what that goal is and how we know if they've reached that goal. And that's where the 3 stages of Understanding by Design come in. Bye. All right, the first stage of backwards design is identifying desired results. So this is essentially when we are deciding our objectives, our goals for the course, or the skills that our students should walk away with. In this first stage, we're really thinking about or really exploring if there are already established goals or objectives for our course. These might come from a department, the institution, other accrediting body, or organization that you work with in your discipline. We're going to think about if there are big ideas or skills we want our students to have after the course is over. Wiggins and McTighe specifically talk about enduring understanding. So think about if you were to run into one of your students, maybe the next semester after your course is over, a year after your course is over, or even 5 years after your course is over, what would you hope that they remember? What are those big things, those big ideas that really stuck and resonated with them? So this first stage is about starting with choices and being clear on our priorities. So you might be wondering why you have a picture of a delicious cupcake in front of you at 12:09. So, you know, an analogy that we're going to talk about, or I may refer back to, is the idea that a baker, what is their goal? What is their objective? Maybe their desired result for their work might be to have this delicious s'mores cupcake that looks really good, but also tastes really good when they're done. So the second stage in backwards design, or Understanding by Design, is determining acceptable evidence. So how will we know when our students have met our goals and our objectives that we identified in stage 1? So thinking about what we'll accept as evidence that the goals and objectives have been met. And essentially this is really thinking about what are our assessments. So we don't want to just be covering content and having students complete activities, but we're really working students towards being able to do something that we can measure and we can observe. So our assessments should really be designed in a way that we are able to distinguish between the students that understand and the students that only seem to understand. And again, this is where alignment will come in. Josie mentioned alignment earlier. So these assessments, this acceptable evidence, should really be connected to what we want to measure and what our goals and objectives are. So if we go back to our baker example, we said that the baker's desired result is that they have this cupcake that tastes good and looks good. But how do we know if the goal has been met? So we have to decide, or the baker would have to do what that looks like. Maybe the customer digs right in. Maybe they talk about how great it looks, or maybe they go back for seconds. These are all things that we have to consider. The third stage in understanding by design is planning learning experience instructions. So really we're thinking about teaching as a means to an end. So rather than jumping right into what we're going to do with our students, we again first think about our goals, determine how we're going to see if students have met the goals. Then last, we think about what instructional strategies and learning activities the instructor will use to achieve the results from stage 1 that can be measured in stage 2. So in this stage, you would think about what activities are most appropriate, think about if there are any component or smaller skills that will add up to the larger skills. You might have activities in the online environment that are scaffolded and provide opportunities for frequent informal feedback. So you can see where the students are, you can give the students feedback, and they know where they are. Again, this should be aligned. So revisiting our baker example, in this situation, the learning experiences and instruction would be either the baker creating the recipe or consulting the recipe and following those steps to create the cake, create the cupcakes that are aligned, and also using appropriate materials, which would be all the ingredients and the tools necessary to create their desired outcome.
So next we're going to talk about a few things concerning effective design. And Judith Betcher has provided us with a great list that we referenced here in this presentation at the end of the presentation. It's called 10 Best Practices for Teaching Online. It's very easy to read and very realistic and practical. She also wrote a book called Online Teaching Survival Guide, which we share with our faculty and we have found very helpful ourselves. But we do want to look at 5 of the 10 best practices. I just chose 5 of the 10 best effective practices that Judith Betcher talks about in that article to share with you today. The first one is instructor presence. So it's important for us to remember that after we build the design of our course, or while we're designing our course, we have to consider what's going to happen when it gets delivered and facilitated. And although instructor presence is something that happens during the delivery, then more than during the planning of it prior to delivery, we really need to take this into account when we are teaching online. So this is more than just providing students grades and feedback, but also or responding to their individual emails. But it is more like making sure the students see you involved and active in the course daily. So this could be posting news announcements, or a video update, weekly video update, or an email blast to the whole class. Or it could be interacting in your asynchronous discussion boards or voice threads, somehow getting involved in their learning groups if you've got that set up. So letting your students see that you are there and interacting with their learning, and not abandoning them into this island of online learning. The second practice that Judith Betcher talks about is clear expectations, which we've already touched on, but I cannot say it enough. We have to be very clear about what we want our students to do, but also we need to be sure that we communicate with them when they should expect responses from us as far as feedback on their grades. What's the turnaround time on that? When should they expect to hear from us with regard to email or questions in the FAQ section of our discussion board? So setting up those clear expectations ahead of time so that the students don't have an unrealistic view of how they think your class will go just based on their previous experiences. The third practice that I've included here is called variety of activities. So it's important for us to remember that we have to provide our students with not just individual work, but opportunities for group work and different ways to get engaged with the content. We know that engagement increases motivation, and we know that motivation helps with the success of our student learning. The fourth effective practice here is called feedback from students. And this is, again, something that you build, you consider in your design, but it's something that's probably going to happen during the actual delivery of your course. But it's important that we take time to pause and ask our students throughout the semester, maybe 4 weeks in, 8 weeks. We ask our students to give us feedback on how the course is going. This is very important in the online world where our students can feel like they are just one student on this island without anyone responding to them. So if you reach out to them, have them respond to you anonymously in a survey, answering questions like what's going well for you in the class, what's not going well, what can I change so that you can be successful in the class. So simple questions that the students can respond to, anonymously and voluntarily, but so that you can get feedback to make sure that the course stays on track with their learning and their expectations as well. Finally, closing the loop. This is something that we sometimes forget about. We need to remember that at the end of the course, it's time for the students to prove their learning, probably with a huge cumulative or summative project, and they need to learn to synthesize that material and show you what they've learned. And it's also an opportunity for them to reflect on what they've been doing all semester long. So reflection is key for them.
All right, the last main area that we wanted to touch on briefly is Quality Matters, which we have a system-wide subscription to, but I know only specific individual institutions subscribe to. So if you have specific questions about that, Denise or Mark would be able to answer them for you. But I just wanted to mention briefly that Quality Matters as a rubric and a process is very helpful because it's specifically created for online courses. So as a process, this happens in different ways all across the USG and nationally, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. But again, the rubric is specifically helpful because it looks at the design of an online course and looks at 8 sort of general areas with 43 specific standards to see how an online course is designed and organized and how navigation is very clear throughout. So there are 8 general standards. They are course overview and introduction, learning objectives, assessments and measurements, instructional materials, course activities and learner interaction, course technology, learner support, accessibility and usability. There's some good information in this rubric, things that it's really just a helpful sort of checklist for you as you design your online class, and I use it really more as a tool for building than a tool for after my course is developed. So there are standards about an instructor introduction is available, student introductions are available. There's a course grading policy and it's clearly explained to students. Feedback and turnaround time are included as policies somewhere in the course. So there's a lot of great information. I encourage you to look more into this. And if you're not a subscriber, you don't have access to this rubric, there are tons of great free resources out there. I did a brief search on free online course rubrics, many of which are sort of loosely based around Quality Matters, but Quality Matters is really just based around course design principles, effective practice, and research from the literature. So you'll get a lot of these same ideas from any of the free rubrics out there. Chico State has a free rubric that you can access just by Googling. Michigan State also has, I think, 1 or 2 free rubrics that you can access. In Coastal Carolina were 3 sort of bigger universities that I saw when I, again, just did a brief research survey or Google search of this. So, I bring up this point just to encourage you to use one of these rubrics as a tool to evaluate your online course after you've designed it, but not just after, also during the design process. Josie and I sort of talk about how evaluation of courses should happen at 4 points ideally. The first is when you're designing a course, and then the second is after the course is designed. You also want to evaluate what's going on, what's going well, what's working while the course is being taught, and then you want that evaluation to happen at the end of the course as well. So 4 different points. Like many of these free rubrics that are out there, there are also a number of course design, planning tools that you can find. This is one that Josie and I developed with some colleagues from our university. We call it the Curriculum Alignment Matrix. And there is, we have a link to this at the very end of the presentation. So again, you can have access to this, or you can Google something else that fits your needs, or you can create something similar. But essentially, this is a tool that you can actually walk away with and use to help you organize and structure your online course. So again, we're looking at that backwards design model. So we're thinking about our course level objectives first. What are those big, broad, overarching ideas we want our students to walk away with? And then thinking about what weeks they're addressed. This might be something that you fill in first, or it might be something you fill in after you've completed this entire chart. So next, you will write your module or weekly, however you decide to structure it, objectives. So what specific skills will students walk away from each week or each module? Making sure that we're clear about those. They're written in observable and measurable terms, maybe using verbs from Bloom's taxonomy. And once we know what we want our students to be able to do at the end of each week or module, we're thinking about the assessment or the accountability piece. The assessment might be really formal each week. You might have a quiz or a paper or discussion board for students to do, but it might just be more of an informal, formative feedback, sort of accountability piece, so you can see that students have done the work, and maybe there is a grade attached to it, maybe there's not. So once you know those two pieces, then last, we're going to plan our activities, our content delivery. What tools are we going to use? What media are we going to include? Thinking really about our assessments and activities there. So that is the end of our presentation that we've developed for you. We want to thank you all for spending your sunny lunchtime with us. I know we haven't seen the sun in quite some time, but we're really thankful that you guys are all here, and we're ready for some questions.
Thank you guys so much. And just from the fact that we have 49 attendees here today, you can tell that this is a really big topic, and a lot of folks are interested in this. If you have a question, you can raise your hand and we will unmute your microphone, or you could send it to us in the chat, which is at the bottom. If you look for that little conversation bubble at the very bottom of your screen on the right and click on that, it'll give you an option to enter your question. Let's see, Chongwu Park is asking if you could share the presentation slides with them. And Traci and Josie, would you guys be willing to do that? You guys are both muted still.
Sorry, yeah, we can upload this to SlideShare, and we'll send you the link to that if that would work.
And then the other thing I want to point out, because they have such beautiful slides but not a lot of information, which is actually what we strongly encourage. If you send me an email, I can send you a transcript that our captioner is doing, so that it'll give you a transcript of the presentation. You guys can just send me an email, and I'll put my email address in the chat bar in a second. Beverly Walker is asking if you guys can give examples of some successful activities that you can recommend for engaging students and providing collaboration.
That's a great question, Beverly. I'm thinking of my students work best when they're in groups. And so taking a group of 30 students and putting them in small groups of 4 or so works well for me. And I usually plan my activities around my objectives, and they're not usually anything other than worksheets that they're going to be working on together and providing maybe a synopsis of in the discussion board area, and then their group has to kind of defend their side on it. So that usually gets a lot of interaction. So they're working alone in a discussion board area, and then they branch out into the whole group discussion area where they post their side, if you will, and then they kind of debate back and forth as to why they feel the way they feel. I like to use what's provided for me in my LMS and not extraneous tools, but I feel like the actual assignment that you build can be engaging depending on, what you're asking of your students to do, instead of just working individually when they have to actually perform something in a group. And the bottom line also about group work is that there needs to be a justification for them doing it in a group of 4. It can't just be simply to talk to each other, or because you don't feel like grading everybody's papers. There needs to be justification for working in a group of 4. So that means all 4 people have to have something to do in that group. So small group work and then bringing it back to the large group works well for me. I'm trying to think if there's a specific tool that I use other than what's provided in the LMS.
VoiceThread is another great tool. I know at KSU we have a institution-wide license, but for many years when I first came to the institution, we did not. So I made it work with the free version of the tool. So you have some limitations of the number of threads that you can create. And if you look more into VoiceThread, that will make a little bit more sense. But they do have a free version, so I would encourage you to look at that. And VoiceThread is essentially a technology tool that lets you have discussions around media, where students can use microphones to leave voice comments, or they can use webcams to have video comments. Something else I really like to do in my course is to give students choice. So I teach a freshman seminar, and one of our activities looks at different resources that are available to students on some emergency preparedness sites. So they can go look at the FEMA site, the American Red Cross site, different things like that, and answer some questions that I provided. Or I gave them the option to record a short 1 to 2 minute PSA about a topic that was interesting and important to them. Now, only maybe 2 students out of 22 took me up on that, but I think it's really important to give students choice when possible, choice in the way they complete assignments and the choice on topics of assignments. I think that gets them more engaged and interested.
Great. There were a couple questions. Let's see, folks. Once again, if you want transcripts, you can email me at the address that I just put in the chat. Also, if you are interested to learn if you have, if your university subscribes to QM, you can also email me about that, the system-wide QM coordinator, so I can find that out for you. Let's see, I think we have time for one more question, and there was a question about the midterm evaluations and sort of that process and how much power you give to the students to alter the course.
That's a great question. So I'm just a real big proponent of asking the students what's going on. Now, hopefully, within the feedback I get, there will be something that I can affect change with. And I tell the students I have made this change because someone suggested it in the feedback, and this is why. Or if I can't make changes, it's important to tell them why you can't make changes. Like Traci always makes a point of saying at this time when we're talking about feedback, some students will tell you, I don't want to read. Well, part of my course is reading, so that's something I cannot change. And you can share that with them. But I don't really, I just have to see how things are going in my class as far as how much I do change and how much I don't change. Usually there's 1 or 2 things that actually, are brought to my attention that I didn't know was happening, something maybe in the LMS that wasn't set right, or when I teach blended, positioning of groups and who's in what group, things that they don't want to share face-to-face. So there's always a few things in there that I can change. I tell students why I make the changes, but it's important that if you don't, just, to tell them the things that you cannot change and why. I don't let this consume a day for me or a long part of my time for me. It's part of an update video, or it's the beginning or the end of a face-to-face class if I'm in a blended classroom. So I think it's important for students to know that their voice is heard and that they feel like they have some autonomy in the course, because our adult learners really thrive on that. So it's important in that regard too.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Josie. Letting students know that their voice is heard, giving them the option to provide feedback in a professional way, I think is very important. I do this about every 4 to 5 weeks in my class. I let students know when I make changes, and like Josie said, I tell them when I don't. One example of this is I had a student ask, deadlines for my assignments a couple semesters ago were due at 11:59 p.m. Well, as many of you know, that's when a lot of our learning management systems are updated. So they were having issues. I wasn't up checking my email at 11:59 p.m. and they asked for a later deadline. I could have said, no, that's my deadline, but I was like, well, what's the difference? That, I gave them until 9 a.m. the next morning. That's when I was checking emails, answering their questions. I could help them with tech support at that time. So that wasn't really life-changing for me to make that change based on their feedback, but that really did give them a sense of, hey, she's listening to us, what we're saying, and the feedback that we have.
That's great. Thank you guys so much. And thank you for your presentation as a whole. It was really informative, and there's a lot of engagement and a lot of folks in the chat thanking you guys for such a great presentation.
Well, thanks for